Welcome to another interesting conversation. I hope, I know it will be. My name is Julie Forkammer. I'm the co-founder of Klimakultur, a Norwegian nonprofit working on exposing the fossil fuel industry's grip on Norwegian society. And also, we are working on climate justice, engaging the culture sector, and starting a lot of interesting and new conversations. And before I invite in today's guest, I would like to mention something I think we should mention more often, and that is how come we haven't stopped the climate crisis? And it's not because humans don't want to or we can't think far ahead. The reason we haven't done enough to fix the climate crisis is that the fossil fuel industry has spent the last 100 years stopping us from doing it. And they have been doing that in many different ways and with a lot of money. And we're going to talk about one of their strategies today, and that is concerning sports and sponsorships. So on that note, let me introduce today's guest. Hello, Freddie.
Hi, Julie. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Wonderful to meet you. And would you start off by just giving a quick introduction, because you do many things, but give us a few.
Yes, thank you, Julie. I sometimes confuse myself at how many hats I have to wear, but my name is Freddie Daley. I help facilitate a network called the Cool Down Sport for Climate Action Network. This is a project that's an offshoot of the advertising campaign that looks at pushing out and banning adverts from high carbon goods and services. And through Cool Down,
advertising.
Advertising.
Bad for
Not
bad.
Exactly. Yeah. And the Cool Down Network is says what it is. It's a network of organizations, athletes, and concerned fans that are both worried about the threat posed to sport from our warming climate, but are also convinced of the power of sport to have these difficult conversations around fossil fuel sponsorship and to push for more ambitious action at every level of society.
But you're also a researcher, and sometimes when I read interesting stuff on the internet, I see it's you who have written it.
Well, that's very kind of you. Yeah, my other job, so I have two jobs, is that I'm an academic at the University of Sussex, and I work there as part of a research project that looks at phasing out fossil fuels from energy systems globally, in particular oil and gas, but also coal.
Amazing. We're going to talk a lot about football today, but maybe also drop into some other sports. The reason I invited you to this conversation is quite recently there came a new report called Dirty Tackle.
Correct.
Dirty Tackle, and I was like, was it the carbon emissions from the global world of football? And I wanted you to tell us some of the highlights from it and why do we need these kind of reports and what is new? Was there anything in that report that surprised you, or is it common knowledge?
Yeah, well, so Dirty Tackle was a report that we brought out earlier, at the end of last year. The sort of origin story of that report was the fact that within football, within global football, there's a real lack of credible, accurate, and actionable data on the environmental impact of the game. This is for a number of reasons. I think the structure of football in particular kind of lends itself to clubs measuring their environmental impact and their emissions, and that tends to follow the sort of established methodologies of scope 1 and scope 2. So, emissions that they're responsible for and can control, and then emissions that arise from the sort of procurement and the purchases that they make as organizations such as energy. None of them are very interested in the sort of scope 3, if you will, which some people call...
Take us through what is the scope 3 emissions?
Well, scope 3 is the emissions that will arise from activities that they don't have control over, but are associated with the club or with the sport. So, to take an example from another industry, oil and gas, scope 3 emissions are the emissions that arise when those fossil fuels are burnt. So many oil and gas companies will only measure scope 1 and scope 2 and only say they have control over scope 1 and scope 2 because once they've sold the oil or the gas and it's burnt by another government or it's burnt somewhere else, hey, that's not their responsibility. And we see a similar sort of logic in football as well, where the amount of fans that are traveling, jumping on planes to get to the games, and this sort of these sort of emissions intensive activities, clubs are saying, oh, that's not our responsibility, we can't control the fans. But this logic is flawed, because of course they do. They set the fixture schedules, they have a role of, in encouraging fans to get to games. So these things, we wanted to challenge this idea that football is responsible for a much larger share of emissions than it claims to. And fundamentally, we also wanted to assess how big the problem is, because I think as a first step, you need to know how big the problem is if you're going to tackle it properly.
So why do you hate football so much? Do you want
Well, Julie, I would disagree with that. I would say I love football, and I love watching it. I'm not very good at playing it, I must admit. I had a brief career at age 12 where I managed to score an own goal in the only game that I ever appeared in, and much to my father was laughing on the sidelines as well. So that was a real traumatic experience for me too. But we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about the.
Maybe you are.
Julie, you're my new therapist.
Yes.
I think I would push back against that argument. I love football, and I want to make sure that it can continue to be played and enjoyed for many decades to come. And I don't think the governance organisations that are responsible for football are taking the threat seriously. And I think they are responsible for ensuring that football has a habitable planet to be played on, because it relies on the natural environment. We need breathable air. We need temperatures that aren't going to make players faint and fans faint. So it needs to step up, and it needs to address the emissions that it's responsible for. And this is what Dirty Tackle does. It assesses every single sort of facet of global football's emissions, from the procurement of energy, merchandise that they're selling, food and drink on match days, through to fan travel. So there's scope 3 aspects, and fundamentally also sponsorship. So sports as a whole, but football in particular, is awash with polluting sponsorship deals from high carbon industries such as fossil fuel firms, airlines, SUVs. There's obviously cryptocurrencies and banks and other industries which are disproportionately responsible for driving emissions and for maintaining this sort of status quo. And in the report, we make the argument, and we back it up with empirics, is that football has a responsibility for those emissions as well, because if you're going to promote a brand, or you're going to promote a company, you're going to promote a product or a service, and that product and service is going to drive emissions higher, that is your responsibility.
So what could you do? Let's start with the sponsorship things, because I talked to a friend who is working within advertising, and I challenged this person on their work with fossil fuel companies, and he was like, yeah, but everything we work with is shit.
Yeah, it's true.
You got Coca-Cola, and then you got fast food, and then you got the fossil fuel companies, and then you got Saudi Aramco, and you got the airlines. And where do you begin and where do you end? And
yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a question I've had conversations with people that are responsible for sponsorship deals within football clubs, and they have said to me, with a little bit of a joke and a bit of humor, who can we take sponsorship money from? And I don't. As a campaigner and someone that works on this, I'm adamant that there obviously are companies out there that are credible and that can sponsor, and that are pushing solutions to emissions and other crises that are affecting us, like obesity and sugary foods and stuff like that. That there are those companies out there, and I would argue that it's important to have these conversations anyway, and to push these ideas, because addressing climate change is a mammoth task. The emissions curve needs to bend at a sort of dizzying speed over the next few years. So we need to be able to pull every lever that's available to us. And in every mitigation scenario, a lot of it hinges on scaling up renewable energies and phasing out fossil fuels. But we need to reduce the demand for emissions intensive products. We need demand reduction. And I think advertising and sponsorship plays a huge role in shaping our desires, educating us on what products and services are normal and aspirational. And we shouldn't be so naive to think that these things don't have an impact on us. They do. And I think we should try and gather the empirics like we attempted to do with Dirty Tackle to make that case, to make the argument that these products and these sponsorship deals, they create harm, not only to the planet, but to people, to players, and to future generations as well.
So one of the numbers in Dirty Tackle, the report, is that the fossil-heavy sponsorships makes up 75% of football's emissions. It's the first time I hear a number trying to calculate that. Would you like to explain that number some more, or is it a number we can transfer to other sports or other activities that are fossil fuel sponsored? And I'm very curious.
Yeah, so the approach we took with the report is, this report was led by Dr. Stuart Parkinson at the Scientists for Global Responsibility, a very impressive scientist. And the approach that he took followed the sort of uptick in demand that was associated with those sponsorship deals. So the methodology that he used was linked to obviously the emissions of the company that is pursuing the sponsorships, whether that's an oil and gas company, an airline, and then linked that to their advertising spend. So how much money were they spending on advertising within sport, and creating a sort of calculation for the emissions intensity for each pound spent. Obviously, there's some gaps in the data. Not all companies, especially fossil fuel companies, report on how much they're spending on advertising because they have their reasons. So we had to use some sort of modeling and make some assumptions, like you would with any sort of methodology that looks to pinpoint a figure on expected consumption uplifts from something like sponsorship and advertising. It is replicable for other industries because, of course, you just need to know about the overall ad spend of a company and its emissions intensity over its entire operation. So we've done it before with winter sports, and we've done it with other aspects of sport too. And it works. The numbers are big. The numbers are scary. But sometimes that doesn't necessarily translate. I think, Julie, you and I obviously working in the climate space, we often hear tons and thousands of tons of CO2, millions of tons of CO2, and it kind of rolls over us. And I think we're people that are dealing with these figures on a sort of near daily basis. For football fans and for sports fans more broadly, I don't necessarily think it translates really well. So, as a campaign, we're always thinking of ways that we can frame this and to show basically causation and attribution. So linking sponsorship to harm, to emissions, and to climate impacts as well. Because I think those are the impacts in particular is very tangible, and we're seeing those all around us. Especially even in the global north. I think most people assume that climate change is something that happens somewhere else, not to us. But as we're seeing, it's accelerating and the impacts are becoming more and more apparent. And I think there's more work to be done, of course, but drawing attention to those climate impacts and saying, this is associated with these companies or with these corporate activities, and repeating that again and again and again so it resonates with people, I think is a really important part of the work that we're doing.
Wow. So what do you think a report like that can change, or what is the end game in the kind of work you are doing and your colleagues are doing? What do you hope to achieve? How can the football sector improve their game?
It's a really good question. I think we probably are quite ambitious and want to achieve lots of things, but I think in terms of football, some acknowledgement of responsibility from clubs, but from the governing bodies in particular. I'm talking about FIFA and UEFA. These organizations which structure football at the elite level and, of course, set an example for how football is conducted, lower down at the grassroots. Acknowledging that climate change is a big issue, it's a big threat, but also that they have responsibility for the emissions that they create. And whether that's fan travel or it's the uptick in demand and consumption from their sponsorship deals, they need to get a handle on that. The first step is to measure it, to quantify it, to understand how it works and how it affects their operations and their emissions reporting, but also to understand that they could cut emissions quite quickly if they screen out polluting sponsors, if they, offer sustainable travel solutions to their fans. There are low-hanging fruit and easy solutions here. Well, easy is maybe not the right word, but there are things that could have an immediate impact on clubs and governing bodies' emissions that they're not even acknowledging at the moment. So I think that would be the first step for them to acknowledge that there's an issue and that they have a responsibility to address it. And then I think the second related point is trying to lay the ground in these sort of cultural spaces, because sport, of course, is a cultural space. The fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel products are on borrowed time. We are facing a very uncertain future, both climatically and the social upheavals that will come with that. So we shouldn't think for a second that these companies are on our side, that they are good faith actors and that they will do the right thing, because the evidence suggests that they're going to dig their heels in and they're going to do everything they can to keep rents and profits flowing. And we need to call that out, and we need to challenge it. And I think that in cultural sectors such as music, the sport too, this is a potentially powerful vehicle, and it needs to be sort of maximized as quickly as possible. So a very tangible objective with this report, but also something that's maybe a little bit more social and cultural that we hope this will contribute towards.
Thank you so much for taking your time for this conversation, because we are placed in Norway and we are special. We are only 5 million people, but we have a globally scaled fossil fuel industry, and a lot of it is state owned. And so you have those big sports organizations with the state-owned oil companies. And until recently, our national youth skiing team was called Equinor's youth national team, and the same with football as well. And what does it mean for a company to have their logos on our sports heroes? How do we perceive it? How does it
it means a lot. I don't think people, I think firstly, we are, as a society, and I'm making a generalization here, but Norway and where I am in the UK, we're so used to advertising and sponsorship that we're almost numb to it. In fact, we cannot understand or even imagine life without it. And I think from that springs an assumption that there will always be advertising and there will always be sponsorship, and that it's some sort of benign industry that just happens in the background, and that its impact is sort of marginal, or in fact it impacts other people. It doesn't impact me because I'm an independent individual and I think for myself. Whatever. Advertising works, sponsorship works. If it didn't, it wouldn't be a $1 billion industry around the globe. And sport in particular is constantly ranked as one of the most trustworthy channels for marketing and for promotion. So through being associated with sport, a company like Equinor that doesn't really sell products to you and me, it sells products to governments, to utility providers, to refineries. They get, through sports sponsorship, they get things that they could never have elsewhere. They get to be associated with the apex of human performance, with competition, with collective joy, with the emotional roller coaster that sport is. So they cash in on that. They get associated with that, and it improves their brand reputation. And there's empirical peer-reviewed evidence that suggests that through being associated with a beloved sports team, over time, fans, they have positive associations with that brand, and they actively forget about the negative and problematic aspects of that company. So, this is obviously true with things like with fossil fuel firms, but obviously it's true with car manufacturers as well. Road casualties are a massive problem around the world, and kill millions. And and we forget about these things, and we just think about the lovely shiny car company that sponsors the team that I've supported for my whole entire life. So they get a lot from it, and I also think they get somewhat protected and shielded. And obviously, we're trying to, the work that we're doing, Julie, is obviously trying to challenge that. But I've spoken to people within football clubs that deal with sponsorship contracts and arrangements, and they often say to me, if we pick a problematic company, let's say an oil and gas firm, the club is the one that takes the heat, the company doesn't. So it's a very safe way for a company like Equinor to get its brand out there, to be associated with all these lovely positive things, to humanize itself. And it doesn't really get too much flack or too much backlash for it. It's the sports clubs that do. And the sports clubs often hold their hands up and say, well, we need the money, and that's obviously a broader conversation about the value of sport, what its role in society should be, and how we should fund it. But yeah, these companies, they get a lot from sport. And of course, we're talking about fossil fuel companies here today, but there's countless examples of human rights abusing corporations or states with very questionable track records leveraging sport to improve their reputation on the world stage. And I think it's a highly effective strategy. And because it's so effective, many other states are pursuing it.
We need some critical questioning and system thinking. And if anyone watching has some questions, you can put them in the comments section. I know I'm not that interested in football. I'm more interested in fuels. But I know in Norway we have a famous footballer called Erling Braut Haaland. And he's playing with, is it Emirates or is it the other one?
Etihad.
Yeah. On his shirt. But last year, a year and a half ago, he was playing a Norwegian national match in Oslo. Mm-hmm. And some people we know, some climate activists, did an action on that match. And the match started with 1 minute of silence, because this was the same week as there was this extreme weather incident in Libya, where tens of thousands people just, a dam burst and many thousands of people died. So there was first 1 minute of silence to honor these extreme weather climate crisis victims. Mm-hmm. And then the Equinor logo started going all around the stadium. And then these climate advocates ran out onto the, I don't even know what you call it, onto the pitch. Thank you. There's a photo of one of those who was just, pulled down, laid down on the grass, and then Erling Haaland is standing behind her, laughing. And when those activists went to court later on, they weren't allowed to use climate as an excuse, because there wasn't a connection between football and climate, even though the National Football Association was sponsored by Equinor. And so that was a little thing from the Norwegian Football Association. Another story was last year we had the ONS, the biggest oil conference in the world, one of the biggest, in Stavanger, where Lise Klaveness, the president of the Norwegian Football Association, she attended several panels talking about ethical leadership and women in sports or something, and also, participating on these arenas with the fossil fuel companies because of the sponsorships Equinor had with the Football Association. And I don't know if those kind of sports people even understand how they're being used. Do you think they know?
I think a lot of sports organizations don't fully comprehend what they're doing and their role in promoting and reproducing the fossil fuel status quo, or whatever you want to call it. I think there is some sort of critical engagement that happens within these organizations. I mean, I've had conversations myself with people and they've said, yes, we know this is bad, but they kind of legitimize it under the guise of, we're going to take this money and we're going to do a lot of good with it, and I don't think football's unique in that sense. I think there's lots of charities and arts organizations that would probably take money from questionable sources, not necessarily fossil fuels, but other sources of other pools of cash. and they would justify it on the grounds that they're going to do amazing work in communities and outreach, and and that sort of legitimizes it in a way. So I do think there is some that the ground is shifting slightly, that people do maybe understand that, well, maybe we shouldn't be promoting this, or we shouldn't be doing that, but it's definitely not widespread enough. And I think that comes from, there's multiple reasons why that's the case. I think, as we said before, fossil fuels hold huge symbolic power. I think this is especially true in Norway with Equinor, but also in the UK. The UK government's sort of dithering about whether to give Rosebank, the largest untapped oil field in the UK, the go-ahead, despite many legal challenges in the courts. Who owns 80% of that? Equinor. So, we still associate.
We're always winning.
We always associate fossil fuels with progress and with wealth and with development. And obviously Norway is a shining example that many other current producers or wannabe producers hold up to say, hey, we can do what Norway did. And of course, the reality is obviously is detached, right? Equinor is obviously often the one that's coming into other countries and taking the oil and gas out, so, extracting the wealth from these places. And
for the people listening who don't know, but in 2024, Norway was the #1 investor in new oil and gas offshore in the world. So we are huge. We really are. But what about the players? Because I think even the Norwegian Football Association is like a UN ambassador for climate and football with the sustainable development goals. And there's a lot of good work being done in football these days, but it's more about the safe spaces, isn't it? How can the players involved in questions like this? Because I know you've been engaging with some football players internationally.
I think players are like football players in particular, but also athletes more broadly. I think they're a really vital part of this conversation and this work. To take football in particular, I think there is a lot of good will and a lot of willing from players, but I would stress that this is primarily in the women's game.
Why is
I think there's many reasons for it, Julie. I don't have all the answers. I think in the women's game, there's less money involved. Unfortunately, it's an earlier stage in its development compared to the male game. And I also think that female players are already on the back foot and fighting for their right to play the game and their right to exist in sport. And I think, when you're in a fight mode, it's not necessarily a difficult thing to say, oh, and we're worried about this issue as well. In the male game, I think players, even though they're young and they should be, if you're young, you might be concerned about climate change, but it's obviously going to affect you the most the younger you are. But these males are insulated from a very young age. A lot of them go into football academies, the age of 6, 7. So they're quite, I think, maybe detached from some social issues, and I don't think that's the case across the board. But climate in particular, because obviously climate is often framed, unfortunately, as a very technical and technological problem that most people might not give a second thought to. And often footballers at the professional level are very wealthy and they lead very high carbon lives. They have multiple houses, they have multiple sports cars, they fly frequently. So that's an inherent tension there, right? How can I speak out about climate change if I'm a elite polluter myself? And I think there's lots of ways that we need to navigate this issue.
Anyway?
Sorry, Julie?
Do you think they should do it anyway? People with perfect lives could talk about it? I
think there's definitely a role for people and a need for people like Messi, Ronaldo to say climate change is an issue. I am worried about it. We should be more sustainable. But I do think that it's important to assess their own positionality in that statement, right? So if you're going to advocate for sustainability and advocate for climate action, you should be walking the talk. You shouldn't be saying one thing and doing another, because that leads you to be seen as a hypocrite. And there's nothing more that the public hates more than a hypocrite, right? And footballers already have to navigate the sort of label of being a hypocrite, by the way. You know, whenever they talk about social issues, whether it's institutional racism, gender equality, politics, they're constantly told, stick to football, stick to what you know. So when they do put their heads above the parapet and where they do speak out on climate and nature, they should be applauded, because I do think it is a very brave thing to do. But I think it's a job for the people that work with players and around players to try and think through, how can we make sure that this is a long-term strategy of engagement where these players can work on bringing people with them. Because I think it's also important to stress that players are not just interacting with fans. I think players obviously have a lot of weight within football clubs to push the leadership of football clubs, within player unions and within governing bodies. They operate multiple roles and in multiple spaces, and it's the job for the people that are working on athlete activism to think about how that could best be utilized to support players and athletes speaking out, but also give them longevity on their campaigns and to keep their energy up, because it's grueling and it's a long-term play, and I think not many people appreciate that. And I would also like to stress that we as campaigners working on climate should never ever assume that climate change is the most immediate and urgent threat posing professional footballers and athletes more broadly. In the UK, there's huge issues with institutional racism within football, and I'm sure it's the case in other leagues. Italy has a huge problem, Spain too. If you're a professional footballer and you're black, racism is a more existential threat to you and a more an immediate threat to you than perhaps climate change is. So we shouldn't always expect players to speak out on climate, as much as those that are working in this space would love that. There are more immediate and more apparent threats to them and their communities that they should be supported and speaking out of. And I think it's the job, again, for us that are working with athletes and players to try and connect those issues together with climate. And to make a cohesive and coherent story about, how fossil-fueled climate change will worsen these impacts, will entrench in racism, and will disrupt their communities and their countries of origin as well. So I think it's really important to take a step back and realize that players and athletes they're humans. They have flaws. They're not perfect. They've got loads of interests, if they don't want to speak out on climate, they don't want to speak out on climate.
So which role does the sports media have? Because in Norway now we had the winter championships, world championships on cross-country skiing, and our national broadcaster didn't mention at all that there was a big climate campaign during that. And do sports journalists, how can we expect sports journalists to be interested in this topic? And do you have any experience working up against the sports media?
Yeah, we've done plenty of work with the sports media, and there are a few journalists that really get this as an issue and try their hardest. But of course, they're fighting their own battles internally, and there are structures and systems at play that maybe prevent them from weaving climate and climate impacts and the environment into every story. I think from our experience, talking about climate impacts threatening play is a very powerful and newsworthy angle, and I think you see that around World Cups where they're going to be hosted in places that are very hot. So there is definitely willing to entertain these sort of arguments around threats, but again, often they're not posed as climate threats. They're just posed as hot weather or incidents that are happening in isolation and are not connected to this era that we're living through of a changing climate. But I think there is also a lot of resistance. Broadcasters, commentators, I think they probably would be told just to stick to the football, to talk about the football, and not bring in other issues. So it's a difficult one to navigate for sure. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done at trying to weave in and educate sports journalists and sports media more broadly about the threat posed by climate change, but also how sport contributes to it, because it's deeply entangled with these issues. but I also fear that this might take a lot of time, and unfortunately, it probably will also take a few more disasters of epic proportions to really bring this into sharper focus. And I'm thinking, we've got a World Cup in next year in 2026 that's going to be taking place in North America and Mexico. It's going to be held in the summer. I don't think it's I don't think it's beyond imagination that there will be wildfires that will disrupt air quality. There will be extreme heat that will disrupt play. And I think if these instances do take place, then that will force the sports media to talk about this issue, and hopefully in a way that's constructive.
And Canada will be at war at that time, and there's a lot of stuff going on, Freddie.
There is, and it's very difficult to try and weave climate stories into every piece of sports journalism. But there's some amazing people that are doing work on this and that are writing books. I mean, Maddie Orr brought a book out last year that looked at sport in a warmer world, and that got loads of pick up in the media and loads of conversations happening. And there's people working behind the scenes to make sure that climate stories are front and center. But you have to think creatively about it. I think talking about athlete well-being and how that relates to like extreme heat, talking about
cricket is a sport that's seriously threatened, right?
Indeed, yeah. And it's obviously a massively popular sport in places like India that are struggling with things like air pollution and extreme heat. It got a broad appeal. So also identifying different sports that speak to different audiences. I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that sport is very social class coded. In the UK, for example, if you're interested in winter sports, skiing, you're probably more likely to be from a middle class background where you can afford to go skiing. Football, not necessarily. Traditionally it's a very working class sport, but obviously through commercialization and expansion, it's become sort of more wealthier people enjoy it too. So I think you have to think creatively about the story you're trying to tell and try and make it tangible to sporting audiences. And I guess talking about impacts, talking about disruptions, talking about kids, grassroots sport, their ability to play, future talent, ability to host tournaments, all of these things.
Yeah, you mentioned kids, and I was going to ask you about it because in Norway, Equinor is backing down from skiing sponsorships and football sponsorships, but they're still continuing to sponsor hundreds of local sports and scouts and culture, kids stuff, beach cleanups, I don't know, all around the country. And we also have other oil companies like Vår Energy, Aker BP, who are sponsoring a lot of children's sports. And you have the big football, big money, big sponsorships with fossil fuels and aviation companies, but you also have the children in the community. And whether it's the west coast of Norway or in South Africa, it's the same all over the world, with dressing those kids up and playing football or another sports and have fun. What do we do with that? Or is that also a problem?
I mean, it's a big problem. I think as someone that's works on these issues and knows what fossil fuel emissions are going to do to the atmosphere and what that means for young children's futures, I think it's quite sickening when you see these associations between youth leagues, youth teams, even community initiatives, and fossil fuel companies. I would stress that this is not anything new. Unfortunately, it's a very old playbook from the fossil fuel industry. I mean, I think specifically back to the Netherlands, where Shell was funding sort of chemistry and science classes in schools, and I think one of the CEOs or executives was reported in saying, like these young minds are they haven't made their mind up about fossil fuel companies yet. We're still positive actors in their mind.
Equinor, who is still saying today that we are sponsoring kids because we are worried about our future recruitment.
Yeah, exactly. I think Equinor in Norway is one of the countries that actually bucks the trend in recruitment. I think people still really want to work for Equinor, and I think others across Europe around the majors probably have a harder or tougher sort of challenge with recruitment, especially getting pushed off university campuses and all of that sort of thing. So, they're going in early to try and influence young minds. and yeah, in the UK, you see it through the sponsorship of science museums and exhibitions that are specifically focused on young children. So it's all about that sort of social license and building up this sort of, or maintaining this symbolic power that they are good actors and they're on the energy transition with us. They're going to help us get there, and that they are serious about protecting our future. And I think it doesn't take long looking at the numbers or looking at what they say in other spaces to realize that isn't the case. But yeah, children unfortunately are being targeted. And again, I think there's work for us to do there around focusing on the harms and building an empirical case for the harms, because if it with tobacco, I don't think people would think twice that you shouldn't advertise tobacco, cigarette products to children. I mean, obviously now with vapes and stuff like that, they are starting to do that. But alcohol, gambling, you don't advertise these products to children. But for some reason, fossil fuel companies are allowed to.
It's not funny. Well, it's like Norwegian oil fun, haha. That Norway was the first country in the world to ban tobacco advertising in 1975.
Wow!
But at that point, Norway wasn't one of the world's biggest tobacco exporters, as we are with oil and gas. But also, I really, I'm curious because in Norway now, Equinor is working together with the science centers, connecting them to sports activities they're sponsoring. So we got the whole, the science stuff and the kids and the sports mixed together. But is the tobacco conversation in this, do you think it's relevant? We use it all the time when we talk about a fossil fuel advertising or sponsorships bans. Yeah.
I think it is relevant, but it also has its limitations. I don't think as a campaign or campaigns that are working on these issues, we shouldn't be wedded to it as a historical precedent. I think like I said, it has its uses. I think it can be instructive of how things can change, how, when social norms, when sort of public awareness of scientific issues around health, and when regulation all simultaneously work together, we can change something that is so ubiquitous and seen as so normal in a relatively short time as well. I mean, when I was young, I would walk around the supermarket with my parents, and there would be people smoking. You don't see that, and I think it's important to point to examples where change is possible and where it's been successful and where it's taken civil society and hard work from campaigners to enact long-term tangible changes. But of course, it does have its limitations.
Oh, maybe you should take just a little moment here to invite in my colleague Erlend. Yeah. He's sitting in the back here, but just to talk a little bit about an example we published on our website regarding sponsorships of winter sports and fossil fuels. Let's see, there you are. Because Erlend talked to Geir Endre Rogn, who was the former youth national coach for Norwegian cross country, and he was the coach of the Equinor junior national team.
Yeah, and the women's team.
And the women's team as well.
No, he was, and he was the trainer in a very special time, I think, because Statoil, or Equinor was then called Statoil. So he was there in the transition between the old name and the new name, and he experienced the difference of their behavior and their strategy in a very critical time. I think they wanted to become a more like global energy company with all the framing that they needed to build around that, and they saw skiing as a very effective place
so what happened?
Communicate. Like in the sponsorship, or
he told about them coming into.
No, they were just they wanted to be more present and present their future strategy for for how to become a sustainable energy company.
For the skiers, so they were like meeting up
Yeah.
and much more involved with the skiers directly than they had been before.
Yep. And make them into great ambassadors for Equinor.
Which they are to this day.
They have succeeded. Like a lot of Norwegian skiers are very, very loyal to Equinor and all their messaging. And every time they are asked like a critical question on what that really means, because fossil fuels are basically just messing up winter sports.
Yeah.
Completely.
Mm-hmm.
And they are very vague. Like they don't feel like they are given the opportunity or have the possibility to speak up straight, I think.
No, it's super interesting. And also to have someone from inside the system talking about what it was like, and also that the Norwegian Ski Association shouldn't take fossil fuel sponsorships because that's wrong. So it's an interesting process now in Norway for sure. And in Sweden, stuff is happening as well. So people can check out our website on that.
Definitely. And I think, the example of winter sports is a really prescient one because the threat is so existential. Melting snow is the foundation of all the sports. And if there's no snow, there's no winter sports. And I think, so I think it feels much more urgent and immediate in those spaces. And you're right, there's been some wonderful work done in Norway around Trondheim, and obviously in Sweden by some of our colleagues at New Weather Sweden around the Vasaloppet. These are shining examples really of what happens when you push the organizers, you get the athletes involved, and you try and engage the public on it. And when you do those things and you do them right, I think it's often surprising about how much support you get from citizens, and they get it. They understand that they feel it. They know that their winters are changing. They know that the seasons are shifting. Things we know that these processes are underway, and there's a lot of, I think, latent appetite to act and to change. And I think having the conversation around sponsorship and commercial partnerships within fossil fuel companies in sport and in culture more broadly, I think it's a crucial vehicle and space to push, because we engage with art, engage with culture on a daily basis. So it's something that we feel comfortable doing. It's something that we do in a routine way. It provides structure to some of us. I mean, especially sport, right? You do it on a weekly basis. You watch it on a weekly basis. So these are fertile grounds and fertile spaces to push. And I would say as well that there are very few social spaces for collective experiences like that are few and far between. They're shrinking. People don't go to church anymore. So what's replaced it? It's culture and sport. And we shouldn't discount how powerful these tools are. And yeah.
But Alan, you've been listening to this conversation. Do you have any questions for Freddie or any comments on?
Or I'm just listening in here. I get a lot of thoughts and ideas, and one of them is So the threat in winter sports is really visible, right? It's easy to understand for our audience and the athletes. And I feel like athletes are watching each other. So footballers are interested in winter sports and the opposite way. Do you think there are some? So if
most people are interested in football and not in skiing,
but maybe in Norway,
I'm just
like
kidding,
no, but maybe winter sports can be a tipping point for other sports or athletes to understand the real threat. So if there is a lot of footballers that doesn't understand that climate change is threatening their sports, would it be easier? Like, could winter sports play a positive role here? Would be the question to you.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think we should be gathering up and collating all the examples where change is happening and where positive action is taking place around sponsorship, but also more broadly around sustainability within sport and culture. I think football is quite unique. So I do think it's quite insulated. I think it attracts a lot of attention. So I don't think necessarily footballers are checking in to see what skiers are doing. I think they're maybe a little.
Just hope.
Maybe they're a little too arrogant to do that, but
Desperate about parts.
Sorry for your loss.
But they definitely care about their own game and their own careers. And I think, and I would say that like it's foolish to think that football will be completely insulated from the impacts of climate change. We're already seeing it at grassroots level, like in the UK. You know, over a sort of 120,000 hours of football is disrupted through extreme weather, such as, you know, in the UK it's predominantly heavy rain. This obviously has a knock-on effect, but we've also seen elite games get cancelled due to storms, due to flooding at the Premier League, and definitely in the WSL, where the infrastructure is unfortunately underfunded compared to the men's game. So yeah, I would suggest, I would invite sort of athletes and footballers to acknowledge that sport takes place within a social system and within a culture, and that is being you know, there's facing upheaval at the hands of climate change, and climate change isn't just an issue or a problem that needs to be addressed. It's an era that we're all living through. So acknowledging that changes are going to happen, you know, by either by design or by disaster is a fundamental part of hopefully encouraging more athletes to speak out.
So, Freddie, we got a question here from a very sports interested person I know. He's called Asbjørn Slettmark. And before I take your question, Asbjørn, I'd just like to show that I brought some goodies that Asbjørn brought me.
Nice.
From NBA basket, plastic cups and all. Thank you for that, Asbjørn. We're going to talk about the emissions of NBA. Maybe not today, but maybe at another time. But Asbjørn has a question here, and I'll just put it on the screen because it's long and it's good.
Mm-hmm.
How can the World Cup be reduced? Is there any chance at all to talk to FIFA and governments about this? UEFA didn't care about the carbon footprint from the Euros. FIFA let Qatar host the World Cup with an equally massive carbon footprint. A lot of football fans. Yeah, let's talk about the fans as well. Feels all of the game already have been lost and stolen. Are there any chance that these organizations and institutions will ever listen?
I mean, that's a profound question, and maybe I'll address that one lastly. But first, I think the US, Mexico, and Canada World Cup is going to be massively emissions intensive. I just don't think that's just because of the expansion. It's got more teams this time around, but also the nature of the hosting countries. Right, they are very far apart, which is going to mean that air travel is the only possible option for fans and players traveling in between games. And then you throw in a layer over that sort of the climate risks associated with hosting a tournament there in the summer months. So I don't think there's a huge way in which those emissions can be cut because of the sort of way that the tournament is structured, the size of it, and the necessity of air travel. I also don't think that FIFA is particularly interested in addressing the emissions associated with the World Cup. They've showed previously with Qatar, when they made their very dubious claims around carbon neutrality, that they will try and use accounting tricks and offset markets to at least make these claims and push towards neutrality, but they're highly flawed, highly ineffective. So I haven't seen anything around the World Cup next year around what they're planning to do around offsets or sustainability, but maybe they won't bother because they got challenged in the courts by us and colleagues last time they did it around Qatar, and we will obviously be ready and waiting if they're going to do that again. And unfortunately, I don't think they're really listening. I don't think they are acknowledging the issue. And this is true of UEFA. I've heard senior people at both organizations say, why does football have to lead? You know, why isn't it business first, or why isn't it other sectors of the economy that need to make these sacrifices? They're always framed as sacrifices to cut emissions. And, you know, obviously our response to that, and the response of most people, would be because you guys have mass appeal and you know, are such a huge world event that if you can do it, and you show and you lead by example about what's possible, then others can follow suit. And I would agree with you, Asbjørn, that football has sort of jumped on this treadmill of commercialization and commodification that's pushing fans out. They're getting priced out. It's turned football into a product, and at the elite level, at least, it's kind of becoming detached from the communities, the cities, and the people that built those clubs, and to which those clubs are so important. So I think something will have to change. Something has to give. But unfortunately, I don't think. Pardon?
If you are a football fan and you feel the sport has lost its soul, what can you do as a fan?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things you can do as a fan. You can obviously talk to fellow fans. I think having conversations on the terraces, talking about what's going wrong within your club, but within football more broadly, I think is a powerful thing to do. There are organisations that are organising football fans around these issues, like Fossil Free Football. They're doing some amazing work on fan engagement and trying to set up sort of localised fan groups around Europe that are targeting clubs. And talk to also get organised. There are fan groups that are pushing back against sponsorship, whether it's climate related or not. We've seen a lot of in Scotland pushing back against sort of alcohol sponsorship and advertising. In Germany, there's been pushbacks against certain sponsors around human rights abuses. So Qatar Airways and Bayern Munich, there was some big fan protests around that. So there are these sort of cleavages that can be pushed.
If you know anything about this, please write in the comment. Asbjørn has a very successful podcast about German football in Norwegian.
Lovely. Oh, wow.
But a lot about the fan culture and everything. So I don't know, Asbjørn, maybe it's time for... Have you had anything about climate or fans reacting to the club's working? Yeah. He'll write it if he has something. But
recently in Germany, there's been there's been pushback against arms manufacturers at Dortmund and stuff like this. So I think there are these, and Germany's got a very unique model of fan ownership over the clubs. So they have a more power, which is maybe not replicable in some clubs in the UK, for example, in the Premier League. But that could be that is a source or a tool that can be utilised to push back against polluting sponsors for sure.
So amazing. We'll have to get you back again, Freddie, and talk some more. I didn't even get to use my props.
Well, maybe next time we can talk about basketball more specifically.
So, no, I was just bringing these cloths because at NBA games and women's NBA games as well, you have giveaways sometimes for every person in the audience. So that could be like 10,000, 50,000 people getting a T-shirt or those towels and there's a lot of games in the NBA. It's 30 teams playing 82 games a year. So there's a lot of plastic going on.
For sure. And in terms of sponsorship, I mean, the US market is the biggest by a very large margin. So, there's a lot of money in US sports, and it's increasing as well. And the other side of that, you talk about the merchandise that they're throwing out and firing at people during games. Procurement power, like sport has got a huge weight within markets to demand certain goods and services, and to hopefully bring down the cost of those goods and services for other people. And it should be thinking about this, and should be thinking about it collectively. Like whole sports, whole league should be looking at how they can use their financial weight to improve these improve sustainability efforts elsewhere.
Thank you. We are almost at the end here. Asbjørn, let's get a last one here. The German fans are very political, and they have an impact regarding Bayern fans and Qatar Airways and Dortmund fans against weapon factory sponsorship. But no big campaigns pro-environment yet.
And that, I think that is a crucial point, actually. And I would like to stress that sometimes you don't need to talk about climate change when you're pushing against sponsorship. Sometimes it's enough to talk about, human rights, or even, the idea that if a football club's based in a community, it should be supporting the businesses that are in that community and that are helping that community, rather than an extractive multinational that's pulling money out of the country. So you don't always have to lead with environment or climate to have these productive conversations and to push these campaigns. And sometimes maybe it's best not to. But when it comes to athletes speaking out on climate, I think it's important to obviously give them the support and give them the resources to feel like they can do that.
Thank you, Freddie. And I would like everyone to check out the Cool Down website as well. There's a lot of great sports stories from around the world. Also about cycling. There was a race in Rwanda now being cancelled due to bad weather, but with fossil fuel sponsorships, of course. There's a small indigenous football club in the Amazon in Peru who has refused fossil fuel sponsorships. So there are many, many people around the world who are taking action on these issues. And we'll try to learn more and do more. Thank you, Freddie, so much, and enjoy your day.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, if anyone wants to find out more about Cool Down and the work we do, then cooldownclimate.org. And you can also email me on cooldown@newweather.org. But thank you, Julie. I really appreciate you having me on and continuing all the wonderful work that you're doing in Norway.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.